And I think we are live, Richard. So thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me. I know that you're super, super busy. For anybody that doesn't know who Richard is, but I'm sure pretty much everybody does, I first came across your videos when I was searching for an understanding about my own childhood and the family dynamic that I'd grown up in particular golden child, black sheep dynamics. And it was your work in particular that really helped me understand the internalized shame and guilt that I had been carrying around for so many years. I developed severe OCD and depression from such an early age, and I feel like that understanding of how much I'd been carrying around with me and how it had been internalized from my environment was the catalyst for me transforming that relationship. And now I work with people that have OCD, and at the core of so many people's OCD is an extremely harsh inner critic, which is something that I know you do a lot of work around. So for anybody that hasn't already watched your kind of story, would you be happy to talk about how you got into the work that you do and your personal journey with, inner critic work? And
yeah, sure. I'll try and keep it brief. I was a self-defense instructor for about 10 years, and I wanted to move. I was doing psychology mixed with martial arts and self-defense, but I wanted to move back into more psychology work. So the idea of teach self-assertiveness to self-defense instructors and self-defense clients. And as I started to do that, I set up a YouTube channel, called it Spartan Life Coach, and then I went where people wanted me to go, basically. They wanted me to talk about narcissism, and you can't really have a conversation about narcissistically abusive relationships without getting into childhood trauma. And I think it was around 2014 I was introduced to Pete Walker's work on CPTSD, from his book CPTSD From Surviving to Thriving, which I highly recommend. And that was a real landmark moment for me in my understanding of how trauma related to pretty much all mental health issues. And it led into, I didn't want to study it. I had to study it in order to help my clients. I had to study the Freudian concept of the superego, which is where we get our concept of the inner critic from, and the ways in which this part of us that we call, well, it was translated into English. I only found this out recently. It's an unfortunate translation, superego, because in the original German, it's overego, which is actually better. Superego is like Superman or Superwoman or some sort of Nietzschean thing, but it just means overego. So there's a part of us that is like a child, that is like a childlike self. And the way in which, when we're looking after a toddler, we hover over them and we check that they're not shoving broken glass into their eyes or whatever it is toddlers seem to love doing. And so we hover over them and above them, and we say, don't do that. Take that out of your mouth. You can't eat a wasp or whatever they're trying to do. So we internalize that as little children as like this floating adult that tells us what is right and wrong. And Freud conceptualized this as the das Überego, unfortunately translated superego, but we could just call it overego. And it's really that floating parent. It's there to say, do this, don't do this. Do that, don't do that. If you go to Freudian analytic theory, it's far more complicated and it's not helpful because you just get lost in a word salad. Just think of it that way. Like it's a good thing. We should have an uber-ego. We should have an over-ego that's telling us what to do. It guides us through values and through morality. And unfortunately, if we're raised in an environment where the parent is either not doing their job through indifference or because of alcohol abuse or drug abuse or their own mental health issues, they're actually actively abusive, it toxifies the superego, it toxifies the overego, and we develop unfortunately, what is this thing that we call an inner critic, which is internalized introjects that should be a parent that's saying to you, well done, you know, it's safe to explore. If you make a mistake, it's okay, we can fix it. But if they were abusive or indifferent, which ultimately to the child amounts to about the same thing in the end, what we internalize is I'm worthless and everything I do is wrong. When we grow up, the instinct, the unconscious part or impulse that's internalized is actually coming from a position of worthlessness. But when it manifests linguistically, what we hear is you're useless, you're worthless, everything you're doing is wrong, nobody loves you. It's like the voice of Gollum in The Lord of the Rings when he fights with himself internally. The fight is between Gollum, the monster he becomes, and whatever he was originally, which I can't remember right now. Thank you, Smeagol, who was, you know, a kindly little warm-blooded fisherman from a fishing village who found this ring, this ring which represents many things, but it can represent intergenerational trauma because it's a ring, it's eternal, and becomes trapped in intergenerational trauma and shows up as Gollum, who's an addict. Trauma makes addicts of us all, whether we snort coke or take heroin. It doesn't really matter. We're always addicted to something. So this is how it relates to your fascinating niche and area of interest, which is OCD, which I see as a kind of addiction.
Yeah, and funny enough, that's something that I talk about quite a lot. I view OCD as being you're an anti-anxiety addict. You're constantly chasing that high of, you know, feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling certain. And we know that life is uncertain. We can't have that. That's an illusion and a surefire way to remain stuck in the cycle. I completely agree with everything that you've said. I think that, you know, when we look at the imprint period, we look at that young age, you are like a sponge. You're absorbing all of this knowledge and how you view yourself, how others view you, how you relate to the world, and you are taking in how others are acting towards you. And for me, what I really understood as I went through my recovery journey was that my OCD would be jumping and chopping and changing many different themes. It would go, you know, from harm-related themes to covering relationships, real events, but it would always again come back to that feeling as though I was at fault or to blame or responsible. And I felt this deep intrinsical sense of it's right, because that's what I had communicated to me in early childhood from my parents. I'd taken on so much responsibility. And I'd almost taken on the role of partner, you know, and parent to my family after my parents had, you know, divorced. So I think that from that trauma that I'd experienced, I'd then gone on to do everything in my power to avoid ever feeling that again, ever putting myself in a situation where I would experience being to blame, and that became compulsive. That became my life's mission, to avoid and escape and chase the high of not feeling those feelings. I really resonate with what you've said, and I think that when you can make that connection, it is almost like seeing the Matrix code. You're able to step back from that internal narrative and defuse from the story, that feared story that you're telling yourself. I think what would be really good to talk about would be some steps that people can take when they are dealing with internalized shame, guilt, or that parental voice in their head that isn't the healthiest thing that they could be experiencing.
This is where what Pete Walker talks about is he calls it psychoeducation, where he sees it as equally weighted in importance to educate the client, you, me, anybody, himself, you know, because he has his own issues as well, of course, like all of us, as being as important as the strategies. And I think The reason for that is you should always know with great certainty why you're doing the thing that you're doing. So if I say to a client, oh, we're going to do some superego work and it looks like this, but they're not clear what the superego is and they're not clear why they're doing it, it's going to have less conviction than if, so when I offer like prescriptive advice, I always try to put it in its place philosophically, as it were, because look, everybody knows recovery from this kind of childhood trauma is hard. It's not impossible, and the situation is nowhere near as dire as mainstream psychotherapy would have us believe. Nowhere near, but it is damn hard. We have to be realistic. Like, there are messages that you should have gotten every hour of every day in your most impressionable point in life, where either you didn't get them at all or you got the opposite message. So it's hard, but it's not impossible. But if we know why we're doing what we're doing, it really, really helps. So when we understand systemically what's happening, what is obsessive compulsive disorder? Well, it's a symptom. It's not a thing in and of itself. It's if there's a tree and there's roots and then a trunk and then a branch, it's one of the smaller twigs and leaves. It's not. So I would say, in a sense, in my own life with my own obsessive compulsive disorder, I wouldn't even particularly focus on it. And I know some therapeutic systems do. They're like, there's the problem. The problem is your OCD about this. Yeah. So how do we deal with that? Yeah. But like you, I see that, you're more concerned with the feelings of anxiety. Yeah. And this is always going to be my way because I'm lazy. And I want really good results. I'm quite narcissistic. I like clients who tell me I'm amazing. And then they tell everyone I'm amazing. And I go, yes, it's true. I am. We can all agree. But the way to get those results is to be systemic and to go for the roots. Mm-hmm. Always go for the roots. So anxiety, it's better to go for the feeling of anxiety than it is to go for the whatever it is, like you're counting tiles in the floor, or you're obsessed with collecting a particular thing, or however the OCD manifests. Anxiety, to go for the anxiety is superior. To go for where the anxiety is coming from is superior. To do the super ego work and be like, well, why do I have this thing called an over ego or an inner critic that's telling me I'm a piece of crap, and that makes me feel anxious, and that manifests as a desire to disassociate from the feeling of anxiety, turns me into an addict to numbness, as you rightly said. Just a footnote there for people with OCD, serial disassociators are your neighbors. They're the people right next door to us. Mm-hmm. People who have OCD and serial disassociators, we can go to pretty much exactly the same seminars and the same therapy and read the same books, because what we're trying, they just haven't taken it to the performative step of OCD that we do. Yeah. So we want exactly what a serial disassociator wants. We want to be out of the body, out of our minds, where all the pain is. Why is it painful? Because the eye of Sauron has taken over the land of the body and the mind, and I want to escape. Dissociators escape into fantasy, whereas I might disassociate into, I might be OCD about drugs, I might be OCD about films, I might be OCD about counting, whatever it is. They go internal, we go external. That's really the way I see it, is the only difference. So the solutions then, as we go through, back from the leaves and the branches, through the trunk down to the roots, and we go back to the source, we need to remember everything that we're doing is an effort to soothe that part of ourselves that feels frightened and unloved. Absolutely. And in danger. Mm-hmm. Everything. Mm-hmm. So every piece of advice I give after this point, anything prescriptive, do this technique, that, tap yourself here, spin around in a circle 3 times. If it's not making you feel soothed, don't do it. Because the techniques are not in the hierarchy superior to the principles. They're inferior to the principles. So you stick to the principles and then sort of the tactics. But if I or anybody gives you a technique that doesn't work, don't give up. it's just that technique just doesn't work for you. Everybody has the right to develop their own techniques based on good, solid principles. We don't just have to be submissive in the face of psychology and an institution, academia, people with with letters after their names. I mean, they're only people, and they're actually not really trained to offer prescriptive solutions. So it's kind of left to, you know, people who are a little bit outside the system to come up with ideas and things that might do this. But the key is there's a part of you. You can call it the inner child if you like. You can call it the id. You can call it your inner spirit. I don't mind. But there's a part of us that must be soothed and caused to feel safe and seen. It must be seen. Children need to feel safe. That's the primal drive, safety. So our unconscious is very much set to safety. If we're trying to do something that we don't feel is safe, we'll self-sabotage every time. The secondary element is seen. I want the adults to see me, not the adults. I want my primary caregivers particularly to see me. So that's why when you hang out with the little kids, like I hung out with my sister's kids, and since they're babies, and I'm looking at my interactions with them, I'm like, it's all here. All of Freud and Jung and Adler is right here. I see it. Because the kids, when you're on your own with them and you're the only adult there who can help them, when mum's away, they do stuff and they run around and they're physically small. They're smaller than adults. I'm not saying anything wild here. We all know this. And they turn and they look at you for meaning. They're always looking for meaning. I put my finger in the plug. What does it mean? I put the stone in my mouth. What does it mean? I fell on my ass and it hurts. What does it mean? And they turn and look to us. That never stops. We do it when we're adults, but we go inward. Usually, some of us turn to cults and religions, but we're an interview for today. They look internally. We look internally and go, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And we're doing this. We're looking in and up. Like, what is it? Tell me, higher value philosophical system. Like, how do I place this trauma? I fell on my ass, figuratively or literally. What does it mean? And so we have to communicate. Well, I don't think we'll evolve past this. There's a communication between two parts: transactional analysis, parent, adult, child, superego, ego, id. Hawaiian systems of spirituality that have this trinity. There's Kabbalah has the trinity as well. There's different parts of us that are in communication. So there is a part of us that must consciously adopt the role of loving parent, and it must consciously accept that there's a part of us that is a child that is in fear and in pain, and we must reach out to that vulnerable part of us with soothingness, with love, and with boundaries. Boundaryless love is not going to help. Boundaries with no love is going to be too strict. That's what a hyperactive inner critic is. It's all boundaries and no love. So we have to find that balance. We have to integrate that balance. So in principle, everything we can say must be in alignment with those principles, any technique we can come up with. So if I offer a technique, or people with OCD who follow you, they see a technique and it doesn't work for them, go back to the principle. What are we trying to do? We're trying to heal that communication between the loving parent and the frightened child, and make the child feel safe and seen. Seen is validation. Seen is existence. Seen is love. Just being observed is internalized as a form of love. That's how people develop narcissistic personality disorder. So, before I get into anything prescriptive, I just wanted to really hammer setting out the groundwork for what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, to be honest. I think, when we're looking at OCD in particular, I think that we have to look at it as a bigger picture rather than just looking at it from a top-down approach. We need to be looking at it from a bottom-up. And it's like a seed, a root problem that then sprouts up into a defense mechanism. And that's how I like to explain OCD is it's a coping mechanism that you developed to survive in your environment, whether, as you've said, some people go to dissociation, other people go to compulsion. But when you can identify that part of yourself that's hurting, and you can reparent that part and offer that part what it's needing, you can see transformation, working its way up. For me, the connection I made, so I had quite a lot of my OCD focusing on relationships, and I would find myself kind of really fixating on whether relationships were right, whether my partners, truly loved me, and, really fixating on an array of different things. And I would find that it would damage relationships. I would kind of feel as though I couldn't get them right. And it was when I started to ask myself, well, why am I feeling these, urges to kind of run from a relationship, avoid a relationship? And it was because I was scared of rejection, I was scared of abandonment, and there was a part of me, that inner child that you speak of, that needed to be consoled for the loss of her father, that needed to be told that she was okay, and that it was nothing that she had done wrong, and that she didn't need to base every future interaction with another person on that bad experience. And when I had that knowledge, when I was able to understand that, I started to, again, be able to diffuse from that narrative, because I think often with OCD, with CPTSD, we get so wrapped up in the inner critic, we get so wrapped up in that voice, and we start to feel as though it's an extension of us when it isn't. And so that's such an important thing to remember, is that this wasn't your fault that this happened to you, and you don't have to choose to align with this voice. You can step back from it. And I think that something that was really interesting for me, looking into why I found it so difficult at different stages of my recovery, I don't know if you've read any of David Hawkins. Professor David Hawkins has written a fantastic book called Letting Go, and he talks about going through the different emotional states to reach individuation and enlightenment. And he talks about gain, so rewards that we get for engaging in certain behaviours, self-destructive patterns. And often when you think of that, you think, well, why would I have any sort of gain from, being depressed and not wanting to get out of bed? Why would I have any sort of gain as to, not being able to leave my house for 2 hours because I keep checking it? But there will be a gain to everything that we do, even if it's subconscious and subtle, even if it's wrapped up in all of the negative things that we can see really clearly. And for me, I noticed that it was about having that control. So when I was engaging in these behaviours, when my inner critic was going off and I was feeding into it, I hadn't realised until I asked myself the question, why am I so scared of letting go of OCD? Why am I so scared at the concept of actually committing to recovery, committing to do the work? It was because in a warped, twisted way, I had this belief deep down that if I punished myself, somehow that proved that I was moral and I was a good person, and that I wasn't getting away with some perceived wrongdoing or some inherently bad trait in myself. But I had to surrender that. I had to let go of that need to align with being a perfect person and actually lean into the uncertainty of life and myself, and accept that I'm imperfect just like everybody else is. And I think that's a really important thing to consider when you're recovering. But I wondered whether you have any experience or tips for somebody who is really desperately wanting to get better, wanting to kind of heal the inner critic, but feels as though they're going against a lot of inner resistance and fear around that.
Well, you said a lot.
Sorry, I have a habit of just waffling and talking quite a lot. I'm Jewish.
Well, you what, sorry?
Jewish, and we do like to talk quite a lot.
Well, that explains
That explains
everything.
it all.
The guilt, the neurosis,
The neuroses, it's all there.
the obsession with psychotherapy.
Yeah.
I think like what you just said there. So there's a lot of topic that you can open up with your channel that I can't in the age that we're living in right now because I am a man. But you should because you've just covered two biggies. One is love. One of the things that is destroying. One of the things. There are many things that are making romantic love in this age very, very difficult. But one of them is that approach to romantic relationships that I see more from women generally, as a generalization, which is to create a sort of a fetishized version of the perfect relationship, and the OCD manifests through the relationship, which of course the man experiences as abuse. He's experiencing that as like, why is this woman staring at me all the time? Why is all the focus on me? Why is this person trying to perfect me? Why am I not being good enough? And as you said, there's almost an impossibility to accept that you may be flawed, that he may be flawed, that relationships are flawed. So they just kind of, there's no such thing as a perfect relationship. And then I think you can broaden that out to politics and what we see with a peculiar type of the social justice movement, which in principle, as a lefty, I agree with. Like the way that they state what the problems are, I'm like, yes, those are the problems. And then they go, here's the solutions. And I go, oh, I don't know that that's going to work out too well for us. But one of the things I see there is an inability to accept that there's evil in the world, and there always will be. And that's OCD. You would, I mean, it's a perfect platform. You can talk about, I can't really talk about this. It just wouldn't go over very well, but you can. And I hope that you do. I hope that you explore this through the lens of OCD, because it's exactly what it is. It's a tremendous amount of gut-wrenching fear about risk in the world and an urge to control. If everybody just did it the way I want, then it will be, and it's like, no.
Are you talking about animus possession?
Pure animus possession. I didn't want to say it. You said it.
Yeah, I
So
said.
you're.
I'll take the heat for that. But yeah, is that what?
I think most people can see pretty clearly right now that the big the ideological, what's affecting the ideological soup that we're all swimming through at the Jungian level is broad scale animus possession and broad scale anima possession. And this is because collectively, maybe we should do an interview on another day about this. We've really failed to integrate the shadow collectively. Now, as Jung warned us, and it was one of the points that Freud and Jung would have agreed on. It's come back to possess us collectively. That's how bad it is. That's how much gunk we've left in the cellar, and it's possessing us. So men are anima possessed, which roughly speaking means the worst elements of ill-aspected femininity have now possessed men, but they're not showing up as noble women. They're showing up as I say, the worst elements of let's use that term, toxic femininity. And in animus possession, women show up with their most ill-aspected elements of masculinity, toxic masculinity. So you have women showing up as bullying men, aggressive bullying men, and men showing up as passive, manipulative, and complaining women. And that's anima and animus possession. It's all terribly sexist. I look forward to the comments on this one. But don't blame me, folks. Blame Carl Jung. And so this really damages relationships. What men do in the OCD sphere, as a generalization, I'll be even-handed here, is they focus more on things. Women tend to focus more on people. So the OCD manifests as being OCD about the relationship. For men, it might be, who knows, cars or martial arts in my case, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. The point is, it's not what it seems to be. It's not an obsession with relationships. It's an effort to mediate the fact that we don't feel good we can't just sit in a room on our own and feel good because we're hurt. And it's more than anxiety. It's a gut-wrenching terror, and it's very, very, very uncomfortable to live through. So we'll do anything to stop it. If we can have an honest conversation about that, then, well, that's therapy. This is what Jung said. It's the therapist's role is to bring us to truth, ultimately. But we have to be truthful. Let's mention Adler. You said about David Hawkins. Hawkins?
Hawkins, yeah.
That everything is gain. This is pure Adlerianism, and I love it. Everything is gain. Whatever we do is gain. My cocaine addiction was gain. My attachment avoidance and intimacy avoidance is gain. My depression is gain. My anger management issues throughout my life is gain. Why? Well, when you heal and you don't have these mental health issues, what's next? Being an adult. What does that mean? Responsibilities and growing up and joining the pack and doing the thing. So there is gain in remaining sick or unwell or eccentric, or however we internalize and twist our own self-image. And typically, this is according to Adler, it comes down to a kind of cowardice. And so Adler famously said one of the core values that we should aspire to that lends itself to broad scale healing is courage. We all need more courage. Adler was like, I'd never met a client who didn't need more courage. So we can say as a general principle, we should be moving towards courageously accepting reality as it is, rather than playing these games with ourselves and with each other to avoid reality just as it is. Because all of that leads to neurotic, maladaptive coping mechanisms like disassociation. And as we said, right next door, OCD, which is right next to it. So there's a lot there. What was your question? I had to cover the points that you raised because they were too interesting. But I forgot your question. Sorry.
I think that you've kind of covered the point on that. I think you really went into detail on how you would deal with an over inflated sense of responsibility. How you would look at that. What's actually going on? I think is half the battle. Becoming aware of it.
Yes.
And I think when you're aware of it, that's when you're able to make those kind of decisions to step back. I think what's interesting in what you've said, when we are kind of possessed by the animus, and we very much become polarized and we fall into cognitive distortion. And one of the things that is really interesting with our OCD in particular is that we tend to do all or nothing thinking and emotional reasoning, and I don't think that society helps with that in terms of, I don't know if you've heard of Alain de Botton, but he holds media fiction as the death of true pure love. Romanticism has been fed to us, and so we're constantly comparing and putting these unrealistic expectations on ourselves that we're then nobody is able to kind of reach those standards, because they're based on two-dimensional people and fictional characters, fictional dynamics, and I think that that's something that we need to be aware of. He blames romanticism for being the death of successful relationships, and says that we end up choosing partners that hurt us in ways that feel familiar. And that's something that resonated with me. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm a big fan of reminding people that the word romance literally means fiction. I mean, the French word for a novel is roman, for the same reason. It's a romance from Roman is supposed to be a medieval tale of chivalry, but never consumed as reality. It was consumed as fiction. It's like reading oh God, what is it called? Twilight, and then literally looking for a werewolf to marry or a vampire. It's not real. It's not.
You don't want to marry a werewolf, Richard?
I'd marry that werewolf.
That werewolf
Heaven.
is a fine werewolf.
And I think there's, look, there's parts of this that nobody wants to hear, and I always enjoy this sort of like thing of people don't like Freud. Like Freud's out of fashion. He was the mean one. He was the cruel one, and Jung's kind of cool and kind of hippie, and Adler's okay too. But listen, if you actually study Jung and Adler, they could be just as harsh as Freud. Freud seems the stern uncle that won't let you play and will make you do your homework. And Jung, he's going to let you do whatever you want, just imagine and dream up UFOs and They weren't like that, not really. They pushed their clients pretty hard. And what was the direction that they pushed their clients in that nobody wants to hear today? You've got to grow up. You're not supposed to remain a child into your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. You're supposed to grow up. And there are things from childhood that we must let go of. And we've lost that sense of sacrifice. We've lost that sense of loss. Like we've lost the ability, it seems to me, to let go and to say goodbye with dignity to that which has gone. And of course, then, if we can't let go of our toys and we can't let go with dignity and we can't grieve, we're in an anti-grieving culture, an anti-letting go and moving on culture. Everything is adolescence. Like being an adolescent is the most wonderful thing, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically. And I look at this and I'm going, are you all mad? Adolescence for me was hell. It was fucking awful. I didn't get my head together until I was 38 years old. And I wouldn't go back for any money, for no money, because it was really tough. But that's what we're up to. And I think, like, for a lot of these things, we do need courage. We do need to accept that we're not children anymore. We do need to sort of move on. And of course, we're going to struggle in our adult relationships if we're trying to fulfill a child's fantasy. And we're comparing our adult relationships to children's fantasies. I mean, Twilight was fun. It wasn't fun for me, but like, it's written for 16 to 20-year-old girls. And the big point of Twilight is to make the decision, the big decision. Like, was it going to be the reliable, loyal, warm-blooded who has the tribe that I can, or is it going to be the cold and eternal? And you go, oh, okay, that's the fun is the decision, but you're not supposed to live that forevermore. You're supposed to enjoy it while it lasts and then drop it, because if you don't, in a sense, we kind of kill life. We kill the ability to enjoy the thing that's next. Because if we only have the capacity to hold on to so much. So if I'm dragging a corpse around, I don't have the wherewithal and the ability to take another living person or living experience or living enterprise next, because I'm dragging my long dead corpse adolescent toys around. So there is a need, I think, to sort of be courageous and to grow up in that sense.
I think there was a book that I read by John Bradshaw. I don't know if you've...
When you said Hawkins, I immediately thought you meant Bradshaw. And I think that's where, I think I've watched Bradshaw YouTube videos and then Hawkins is in the related and I never got around to it.
I feel like they've influenced each other quite a lot.
Right.
Yeah, he has a really great book called Reclaiming the Inner Child, and he actually talks about different developmental ages rather than viewing it all as one inner child, but looking at your inner child being stuck at different stages. And
I've never heard that. Smart.
It's really clever. It's a really great book if you get a chance to read it. But yeah, he talks about, going through the kind of infant, preschool age, and then going into kind of adolescence, and then breaks down the kind of differences in terms of the types of work that you would be doing around that. But what would be your best kind of tips or advice for somebody that is wanting to kind of, as you would put it, kind of mature and step up into that kind of adult confident role where they feel trust, because that's something that OCD sufferers really tend to struggle with, is that trust in themselves that they've got it.
So just to reiterate, as I give prescriptive things, if it doesn't match what I said earlier in the interview, don't because
our own unique journey. And I think that I understand what you're saying. You have to try things, and if it doesn't work, you then can try something else.
Absolutely. And what works for one won't work for the other. Your relationship with this therapist might be perfect for you. I might meet your therapist and be like, this person's an idiot. I hate this. Like, that's life. And we shouldn't, it's not uniform. Like, we're all different people, and that's totally fine. Like, I don't demand people love Freud, Jung, and Nietzsche the way that I do. It's senseless, because they'd be like, well, they're just really boring, lectury old dudes. So, like, yeah, they are. I get something from that, but you don't like it. That's cool. I have a YouTube channel called Fortress Mental Health that goes deep into resolving complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but the videos are designed in such a way as that they would work for intelligent 16-year-olds. So it's not psychoanalytic word salad. It's clean language. So if people want to go deeper into that, that would be helpful. People watching this might be like, I don't have CPTSD, I have OCD. And I would say, well, probably what's happening if you have OCD and you want to resolve it, a few of the things that we do for general trauma responses would work for OCD. Number one, become friendly with your emotions again. Like, don't shut them out. Don't treat your emotions as unwelcome guests, as just annoying inhibitors to you living your best life. All of your emotions are intelligent messengers. They have positive intent for you, and they're trying to keep you safe. They're trying to move you away from danger and move towards things that are likely to cause you to thrive. The way they deliver their message may be irritating, may be disruptive. You might find it ugly. You might have judgments about it, but your emotions really don't give a poop. I won't swear on your interview about what you think of them. They are, you are the king or queen of your empire. They have a message to deliver. They're banging on the royal court door, and they will be heard. The more you ignore them, the louder they get. Now, you can either have them rioting outside the door, and you can turn up the music in the royal court. We'll stick with this Game of Thrones theme because it's fun. Turn up the music and keep swilling wine and pretending it's not there. But everybody at court, all your parts of who you are, can hear it very well. And people get anxious, and they get sad, and they get depressed. If you repress your emotions, you will be ultimately depressed. Your sex drive will disappear. You won't enjoy the music you used to love anymore. Your hobbies will be grey and dull. You won't dance, you won't laugh, and you'll generally be a bit of a pain in the arse to be around, because a repressed individual isn't really much of an individual at all. You're not really, to use like slightly spiritual framing, you're not really there. You're not really, the life force isn't in you. It's out of you because you're suffering so much. So don't repress your emotions, welcome them. I have a method for doing that. It's called the emotional literacy exercise. But nothing anybody can do for you, and no money you can spend or course you can go on, a book you can read, is going to help you if you can't listen to your emotions. I said before, the inner parent needs to make the child feel safe and seen. How's the inner child going to feel safe and seen if you say, if you're angry, that's unacceptable. If you're jealous, that's unacceptable. If you're irritated, that's unacceptable. No. So you won't see them then, and you won't nurture them, and you won't make them feel safe. With the emotional literacy, we start by validating it and saying, okay, I have a feeling, and that's okay. It's an ugly feeling. Well, that's okay too, because people have ugly feelings. If you act on it, it's immoral and potentially illegal. But a thought is not an action. A feeling is not an action. You feel bad about something. Okay, welcome to human life on Earth. This is how it works. Some of it's really gross, really icky, and really ugly. Like, what is it I get? Girls shouldn't feel angry. It's ugly and unladylike. Okay, you're going to have to get over that. Well, boys shouldn't feel sad because, like the Cure song said, boys don't cry. Well, you're going to have to fucking get over that, because boys do feel sad and girls do feel angry. Now, we can all pretend that ain't the case, and we can keep putting makeup on it, but we've seen where it's got us so far, and it's not good. Like, where we're now is not good, because we're just layering makeup on the truth, and it's rotten. It stinks now. It's stinky. We're stinky people.
No, I really resonate with what you're saying. I think there's a really, really famous poem by Rumi, The House Guest, I think it is, or The Guest House, where he talks about treating all your emotions as visitors rather than residents. They're visitors, and you welcome them in and you welcome the message in. I think it's really important as well to differentiate between an emotion and an emotional state, because I think that we can, experience emotions that bring us messages, but if we're stuck in an emotional state, that's when it needs to be addressed, when that's something that we need to work through and really process, well, why are we having that emotional response and why are we trapped within it? I also think that, in terms of our emotions, we can look at an emotion as a neutral thing, because society tells us that, when you're a child, you're sad, instantly everybody rushes around you and says, there, what can I do to get you out of this state? Thereby communicating that there's something wrong with being sad in the first place. And actually it's perfectly normal to, sadness, it releases, the tension that we're feeling. It elicits sympathy and support, which is something that's fundamental to human nature.
Yes.
I think that if you grew up in an environment where someone told you it was fantastic to be angry, you'd be really jumping for joy, you'd be ecstatic every time you felt rage. But we're living in a society where everybody communicates that we should be happy all the time and we should, stiff up a lip, as Brits say. So I think that, yes, it's really important that we understand that we're, in addition to experiencing an emotion that is neutral, attaching a meaning to it, we've decided that these are difficult emotions, these are bad emotions that we need to get rid of. And actually, when we can sit with the emotions and be present with them, they're more likely to move on. They're more likely to process. The animal kingdom, when an animal goes through trauma, when they're, in the middle of a hunt, they'll show the animal shaking it off, having a very physical, somatic kind of response to the trauma, and then being able to move through it and then kind of bounce back into their baseline. But humans tend to want to avoid, not be with the emotion, because it's uncomfortable. And as Jung says, what you resist persists. So we then get stuck and we feel trapped in these emotional states. I think it would be really cool to hear more about how you feel it's best to sit with emotions and allow them to be there. Are there any tips? You mentioned the emotional literacy. I know you've got a course on that, which is fantastic, by the way. So
Free as well.
yeah, I'll push to it. But it would be great to hear more about that technique and how somebody can master sitting with their emotions.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, like, Rumi is great. I just wish he'd stop plagiarizing my work, present as like Persian Sufi wisdom, and pretend like 1,000 years before I was born. It's just cheeky what he's doing. No, I do like Rumi. I do like Rumi a lot. I think the core thing is having that sense that you can have an emotion without being the emotion. And so I tend to teach people, like, make friends with your emotions and try and emotionally regulate, because when you're emotionally dysregulated, your perceptions are really skewed. Your boundaries between yourself and others get very blurred, and your internal boundaries get weak. So try and get emotionally regulated. And then the next thing is, once you are a little more emotionally regulated, is to set up some internal boundaries and distinguish between a thought and a feeling, to engage in critical thinking. Just because you think something is the way it is, maybe it isn't. What's the evidence for it? Maybe there's a counter evidence to it. Just because you feel something is true, is it true? Should we act on feelings? And that brings you to the third thing that I think everybody should do. Painting with broad brushstrokes here, but I think that this is actually more helpful in getting into extremely technical solutions therapeutically, because if I give broad brushstrokes, they're principles based, and then people can find their own techniques for it. So the third thing would be to develop your own moral philosophy from scratch. When I say moral, I mean values based philosophy. It doesn't need to be Kierkegaard, but if you can answer some simple questions, most people can't, but if you can answer the following simple questions, you will feel safer, you will feel saner, and you will feel more able to deal with life. The questions are as follows. What is good? What is bad? How should a person live their lives? The point of the exercise is not to come up with answers that are going to change the world, because they're not. Every answer we come up with is dogma, and what looks great tomorrow will look like dog crap tomorrow. What is great today will look like dog crap tomorrow, so don't worry about it. The point is to try. The point is to make the effort, and through making the effort to grow those intellectual, emotional, psychological muscles to be able to distinguish. It also helps us, keeps us protected from abusive relationships and propaganda and various other pieces of nonsense in the environment. If you have your own sense of what is right and wrong, and you have a sense of how a person should live, if somebody comes to you and tries to get you to do something that's outside of your sense of what is right and outside your sense of how a person should live, you can simply tell them to go away. If you've never tried answering these questions before, it's much easier to tempt you. It's much easier to lay an impression on you or lay a glamour on you to make you do something that you wouldn't otherwise normally do. So that's largely my advice at the moment, is become friendly with your emotions and become emotionally regulated. Set internal boundaries, set discipline with yourself, learn to say no to yourself. You should not be obeying every whimsy and impulse that comes your way. It's not going to lead to a good life. And the third thing is to develop that philosophy and develop a new philosophy of life so that you can cope, so that you have self-respect, so that you have a robust sense of how to live. We need meaning in life. We need to have a sense of what we're doing. We're not consumer flesh suit robots, but that's what mainstream propaganda will tell us. That's what Edward Bernays convinced the world of, Freud's nephew, and it's what people like Noam Chomsky, when they're talking about coerced consent. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. These are ideological persuasions that we're helpless in the face of, because since we lost religion post-Enlightenment, well, we didn't replace it with anything. So we just went, yeah, we're consumers. That's all we are. Well, consumers are children. They have to be adolescents. If all we are is pleasure and dominance hierarchy games, well, we're still in high school forevermore. We'll never leave high school. We'll always be in secondary school. We won't even get to university. We'll always act like 17-year-olds until the day we die, trying to prove how awesome we are and trying to prove how much fun we're having. You mentioned social media before. I mean, that's the clearest manifestation of the sickness that we have in our culture right now is social media. I mean, if it wasn't for jealousy is the fuel that social media runs on. If you took jealousy out of that Jenga tower, that house of cards, the whole thing would collapse. If you couldn't make people jealous, it wouldn't exist anymore. How puerile, how pathetic. Like, that's really sad. We have all the technology, all this knowledge, all these years of experience and science and medicine, and this is what we're doing with it. That's a bit crap, isn't it? I think we can do better. I really do think we can do better. I know you're asking me about the individual problem, but I can see also how this manifests collectively, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do. And I think as well, you could even look at social media as that a lot of people have that, really vulnerable part of themselves, that inner child that is, really, really searching for that validation that perhaps they didn't have, personally in their own lives. And I think you can then get, trapped in that cycle and the dopamine rush that you get with, looking for validation outside of yourself. And that's why the work that you do, the work that I do with clients as myself, is so important when we are starting to look at, well, we need to become whole in ourselves. We need to be our own source of happiness. We need to be our own source of support. We need to be our own parent. And that, I think, is how we start to move away from, looking out at social media as a source for that. We've got to be the changes, cliche as it sounds, we have to be the changes that we want to see. I think, interesting, going back to your point about emotions, a technique that I find really helpful is the welcoming emotions technique, which is simply a response technique of when you're experiencing emotion, you know, whether that be sadness, anger, almost speaking to it as if it was a kindly relative or a friend. You know, welcome anger, I'm happy you're here. And often it can feel very foreign and strange to begin with because it's going against your default setting. But we know that the brain, you know, is malleable, and we can create new neural pathways. And the more that we commit to healthier actions, and that, as you said, commit to values, have a value system, set boundaries for ourselves, the more that we can move away from that unhealthy inner critic and those coping behaviours that don't serve us and don't serve the people we want to be. And that's something that I think is a really, really important thing to stress. I think that the last thing that I'd like to really talk about with you would be if there's any tips or any sort of things that we've missed that would be vital to somebody who is perhaps in the beginning of their journey and they're like, I want to transform my inner critic into an inner ally, and imagine that this person's a complete newbie. I think that'd be a really nice way to kind of wrap this up and leave this on a high.
There was an email exchange I had with Pete Walker last year about this particular issue. He gave me a couple of tips, and then I put my own little spin on it because my background is martial arts, and the first philosophical system I was ever interested in was Chinese philosophy. And he was talking about a two-tiered approach that he teaches clients to deal with the inner critic. One he calls angering, which is when the inner critic kicks off and starts being punitive and critical and telling you you're useless. He encourages clients to resist it and to become angry with the inner critic and to, you know, fight back, to push back and say, screw you, you know, this doesn't even make sense. You're always telling me the worst possible outcome and how you never offer me any useful advice. Why don't you shut the F up, you know, and push back? And then following that, the second tier would be, what should the inner critic have said? What do you want your over ego, your inner parent, to be saying to you? Well, presumably you don't want anything saccharine or Anthony Robbins. Like, you don't want it to be like, you're the best, you could do anything. Yeah, you don't want that because, well, it's weird, and you'll have another problem be in therapy for a year later. But you do want a good parent, in my humble opinion, would say things like, you know, it's okay. Like, whatever you're doing, it's okay. Just do your best. It doesn't have to be perfect. Or you drop something, it would just be like, oh, you dropped it. Never mind. Well, we can clean that up. It's not a drama. It's not a catastrophe. There's an emotional regulating tendency that can be there in parenting, or it can be extremely emotionally dysregulating. Oh my God, you dropped something. You're such an effing idiot. You're just like your father. What are we going to do? This is and the child, of course, is like, oh my God, full of guilt and shame and fear. We can be emotionally regulating. This is what I try to do with people in coaching, or when I'm training people in martial arts, whatever they do, because people make mistakes. Wow, how incredible. I mean, I'm sure that they did it just to upset me. And so they'll look at me like, oh my God, I made a mistake. Like, I'm going to shout at them. And I'm like, it's fine. Just try again. Yeah. And they're like, oh, what does it mean? It means that you try again, because developing new skills, I'll let you all in a little secret, takes a really effing long time. Way longer than we in the West think. In the East, they know. You switch off your ego, you switch off your mind, and you put the reps in. Relax and put the reps in, because otherwise you won't grow skill. In the West, we're like, 6 steps to dominate the flippity jib and 6 weeks to be a millionaire with a 6-pack. If it's a day over 6 weeks, I'm not doing it. In the East, it's like, what are we doing today? Training. What will it be? Whatever I tell you it is. But chill out. This is going to take some time. Put the reps in. So that's life. Life is like that. Life is not little tiny pieces of sections of achievements, and then you get a gold, and then it's this. That's just not life. That's a really neurotic way of looking at things. It'll drive you crazy. as the Thai say, sabai sabai, just relax, have a good heart, be I have lots of Buddhist pictures around me here, so I keep going to Thailand. Jai di, have a good heart, clean intention, sabai sabai, how you doing today? I'm good, it's a good time, it's a good day, let's keep going. That's the kind of internal voice that we want to have running, that's just going to tell you everything is okay. And you must, I teach this in one of the courses, like, if we didn't have good parents and we don't know how to be good parents, we have to construct one.
Yeah.
So make them up. Like, I don't know, you can choose, it's your head. You can have Matthew McConaughey if you want. You can have,
if you want.
yeah, right.
Quite wise.
Just, yeah, you can have a cartoon one. You can have, you know, Jesus. I don't care. Nobody cares. Whatever you think. You can have Jung. You could chill with. And this is a Jungian process. He did this for himself. He would have characters inside of his head he would speak to. You're going to have interjects. You're going to have an internal dialogue in this life. It's not going away. Nobody watching this is going to become a Zen monk. So forget about that. So have them be good. Have them be funny. I have stand-up comedians sometimes. I'm like, well, what would Louis C.K. or George Carlin say about this, or whoever? Like, keep a sense of humor, stay calm. Everybody's doing the best they can. The baseline state of humanity is somewhere between despair and desperation. Trust me, this is all I've done for 8 years, and that's it. Everybody is struggling. The billionaire, the athlete, the whoever, the celebrity, they're struggling. Why? Because we're fragile little creatures clinging to a rock that's spinning through space. Of course, we're a bit neurotic and a bit paranoid and a bit jumpy. So it's cool. Just relax, but try and have that relationship with yourself where never speak to yourself the way that you wouldn't. Don't let yourself speak to yourself in a way that you wouldn't speak to a child. Like, you wouldn't speak to a child who make a mistake, like swearing at them and saying, you effing useless. Well, I wouldn't talk to my 3-year-old nephew like that. So I'm not going to let myself talk to me like that. Because if I did, well, I'd be a hypocrite and I'd be a neurotic. And I'm not being a good role model for him. Because kids pick this up. They pick everything up unconsciously. They do, not what we say.
No, I completely agree with that. I think if I was going to have a character in my head, I'd probably have like a Game of Thrones small council, maybe. I don't know. What would you have?
I like the idea of a small council. I really liked, that reminds me, I really liked, from Game of Thrones, I'd have Ned Stark, because he was in a laconic Spartan way. He did a few jokes, but like a northerner, you know.
He seemed quite balanced as well. He wasn't very polarised.
He was chill.
Yeah,
he was too naive because he was too noble. I love the way he was written. They're actually really intelligently written books. Like, he's an archetype of a man out of step with the corruption, because everything around him is just evil and corrupt, and he's a good man. And there's a warning there, which is like, if you're good and you have your principles but you're naive, you get your head chopped off. Tyrion's stoic as hell. He's funny. He puts up with a hell of a lot, and he keeps saying funny things. So those two, I'd have in my head for sure.
I completely agree, and I think humour again is a really, really great tip. I used to use deliberate uncertainty and humour responses whenever my inner critic was kicking off, and I found that was a really, really helpful way to kind of move away from, you know, fusing with it, and also to start to kind of change the way in which I was, you know, relating to it. So I would say, of course, I'm all about that, and I would just kind of go along with it. And what I find was that the voice would almost kind of get annoyed and bored with me. It would almost be like, oh well, we're not going to keep going on at Nova because, you know, we're not getting the response that we want.
It's not working, so there's no point bullying this person because they're not.
Exactly. When you face a bully and you say to them, you know, you've offended me, they're more likely to, you know, take the bait. And if you're able to kind of stay calm, stay stoic, then eventually they get the message. And I think that's the same with the brain. The brain starts to learn that these thoughts aren't threats, these thoughts aren't dangerous, that we don't have to align with them, and it stops flagging them, it stops bringing them up as much, and we start to kind of move away from that thinking pattern. So I think that's a really good take home.
Sure.
But yeah, Richard, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I feel like we could just keep chatting about this, to be honest, and I hope that at some point in the future we have another chat about something.
Whenever let me know.
I'd absolutely love that. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on live with me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.